Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Farm Country Update, a view from the field, the preview of the 2021 Pro Farmer Crop Tour. I've got a great panel with us today to help with our discussion. That includes AgriTalk host Chip Flory, Pro Farmer editor Brian Grady. I'm Clinton Griffiths, host of Ag Day and Farm Journal editor. Hey, fellas, thanks for being here.
You bet, Clinton. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to be here, Clinton.
Absolutely. Well, this year we're getting ready for the crop tour. Supposed to take off, I guess, if we look at our watches, this could be happening here in about a month's time. And Brian, this is another year in the crop tour. It's starting to get a few years under its belt here, 29th year.
Absolutely. So a month out, it's starting to get real now. Now's when we put on the final press here to get everything ready. But like you mentioned, 29 years of doing this, so we have a little bit of history behind it, and we kind of know what we're doing out there. We'll tour 7 states across the Corn Belt, from Ohio to South Dakota and Nebraska, up to Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And at the end of the week, we're going to pull probably about 1,500 corn and soybean samples. We'll cover, thousands of miles cumulative across the Corn Belt states there. And, the objective is to get a good, solid representation of what the corn yield is across the entire Corn Belt.
And Chip, this obviously always gets a lot of attention because of the timing of the crop tour, and that's on purpose.
Oh yeah. And after some of the changes that USDA made in their August survey, I think it picked up some additional attention here just recently. It's still a survey estimate that USDA will give us in August 10th or 12th, something like that, when we get the crop production report. Corn and soybean yields will be a survey-based estimate. It's no longer a projection when we get to August. But USDA doesn't do any of the field observations, their objective yield plots that they did previously. They wait until the September update, and then they'll duplicate in October, November, and then for the final in January. But so what that means is the crop tour is really kind of the first organized group now to go out and pull husk back and take a look at what's under the husk. And not only that, but we've got farmers that do it. We've got people that really understand what the weather is doing to a crop, taking a look at what's under the husk, pulling open the bean rows, taking a look down the rows under the canopy in the bean field. The people that are out there doing this, for the most part, Brian, the core that we've got now that goes out and does the scouting, my gosh, there's a lot of experience, a lot of crop tour experience in the core group that goes out with us.
Absolutely. We have a lot of returning scouts, and that's our core that you talk about, and both on the eastern side and the western leg as well. They are the base, and then every year we kind of pick up new ones. And last year with COVID, we had to change things up a little bit, not from how we do things, but more so like 2 scouts per vehicle and those types of things. We got introduced to a lot of new participants, a lot of new farmers that joined us last year that hadn't been on crop tour in the past, and many of them are coming back again. So we see that core base, continuing to come back and giving us that expertise of many years of farming.
Yeah.
And guys, one of the things, and you mentioned it, Brian, obviously we had to do some things differently last year because of COVID. One of those was Chip was with me in South Bend, Indiana, where we kind of helped to anchor things remotely via a web simulcast. This year, we're going back to some in-person events, but we're also going to keep doing the simulcast because, hey, that's a great way for people to be able to tune in, regardless of whether they can make it to one of those meeting locations or not. And this is kind of a list of where our locations are and the dates. Talk a little bit about what you guys expect from those in those stops each night.
Well, first off, I think that, every year you kind of have an idea of what you're going to see based on, crop condition ratings and anecdotal reports that we get in from pro farmer members and others. So we have an idea, but with that said, we want to go in with an open mind, and we don't want to have any preconceived ideas, so to speak. But, I think it's a pretty clear divide this year between those that have gotten the rains and those that haven't gotten the rains. And it's that far northern and northwestern area of the Corn Belt that hasn't gotten the rains. As you can see on the map there, we don't get into the areas that will be the poorest this year. That doesn't mean that Pro Farmer, when we release our estimates at the end of the week, which are separate from crop tour data, which is 100% data pulled from the fields, we'll take into account those areas outside of the crop tour states. But the crop tour data will be, restricted to the 7 states that you see in those rough areas there. So we take the heart out of the Corn Belt, but we also take into consideration when Pro Farmer puts out our estimates, those other areas as well.
Yeah, Clinton, Brian said something very important, and he said it so many times in the past that he just, he threw it in there just as a matter of fact. We do it the same way every year.
Right. Right.
That is the bottom line. That's where the consistency comes from, and what brings value to the tour. If all of a sudden we would say, you know what, that Western Belt, doggone it, we better get into North Dakota and up into the Red River Valley and throw that in. And you know what, let's take out southern Minnesota this year and not do that. Well, that doesn't do anybody any good, because we don't have anything that we can compare to. We've been running these same routes now for at least 15 years, Brian. And before some of those Western, well, it was 1998, so longer than that, 22 years, okay, 23 for this year. But when we added those routes in the West, we actually had people out 2 years before we added them to the tour, running those routes to give us base data that we could compare to before we publicized anything that we were collecting on the Western tour at that time. So it's not like we can just jump into North Dakota in a year like this and add it to the tour. If people want to go out at the same time and use the same process and take a look at crops across the state of North Dakota, awesome. Report it in. We'd love to take a look at the data. We're not going to include it in the crop tour data, but boy, we'd sure like to see what you've got. There's no question about it. But doing it the same way every year, running the same routes every year, pulling basically the same number of samples every year, even last year, that's what has brought the consistency to the tour that I think gives the tour so much attention.
In Clinton, we often get asked, do you stop in the same fields every year? No, we don't know for certain, because we don't keep track of the fields individually. What we do is run the same routes. And along those routes, the scouts are instructed to stop about every 15 miles or so and pull a sample. And so that is some of the randomness of it, that, it's true data coming out of the fields, that there's no preconceived fields that we're going to stop here and that type of stuff. We don't just stop at the best fields. We don't stop at the worst fields. We have 15 miles to determine where along that route we want to stop when we get to that point, and it is truly random.
Yeah. Man, I've been along with you as you stop, Brian, and you pull over, walk out, pace out a certain set number of paces out into a field, and you may be standing in a water hole at that point, but that's the number of paces into the field that you go. And
that's the randomness of it. You don't know from the road even, and like I said, we're not picking the field based on the looks of it, good, bad, or indifferent. We pick a field and then we pace out into it, past the end rows and then 35 paces. And from the road, you don't know. On some of the rolling hills, you can kind of get an idea, but if it's flat from the road, you can see absolutely nothing out into the field when you go in there. And sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, sometimes it's a unpleasant surprise, and sometimes it looks just like the rest of the field appears to look.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I would just want to let people know that if they have questions for us, go ahead to the question and answer button on your screen. You can type in some questions. We'll try to get to those and answer them along the way. Guys, I want to talk a little bit about some of the newsmaker type of things that we'll be discussing and discovering along the tour this year. And Chip, I guess we might as well just start with the elephant in the room, which is the drought and what's been going on in the Northern Plains and in the Western US. Obviously, Crop Tour isn't going to get into a bunch of that, but it will get into some.
Well, take a look at that area there in southeast South Dakota. We spend most of the time in crop districts 6 and 9. We pull a couple of samples out of 5, which is in the south central part of the state, but most of the samples are going to come out of crop district 9, which is in the southeast corner of the state. Some fairly intense drought conditions in southeast South Dakota. They've gotten some relief here recently. The report that I continue to hear from growers in the area is, can't believe how good the corn looks for as little rain as we've had. And I know I know that's true. And I know the corn in many cases looks really good. But when we were experiencing some of the driest conditions that we've had this year that really set us up with the intense drought that we've got in some of those areas now, there was a lot going on in those plants when they were feeling stress. They were setting the ear size in many cases. So we'll take a look at that. A couple of other things that a map like this is hiding from us, Clinton, as far as the news goes or the potential news items that we might discover. Remember that the days ahead of Memorial Day got cold.
Right.
We had a freeze through areas of North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, into northern Iowa, the northern third of Iowa. So that Wisconsin would be included in that, even though we don't get into it. Northern Illinois. I wonder if that had any impact on stands for corn. Probably won't show up too much on soybeans, but I wonder about the stands on corn in those northern production areas. That's something that we're going to look at. Another thing that this map doesn't show us and can't show us is I had a conversation with Ken Ferry on Wednesday on AgriTalk, and he talked about the really soggy conditions, Brian, that you're going to be looking at in the Eastern Belt.
Absolutely. That's a drought monitor. It doesn't tell us, the excess moisture areas. You'll see it here with the root zone soil moisture. That there is a significant divide between the wet areas and the dry areas, and it seems to be getting wider with all the rains that we've had in some of those eastern Corn Belt areas. We in all likelihood will experience some areas where crops are lost, drown out spots, those types of things. And if we fall in one of those areas when we pace out into the field, it will be measured. And that's the thing to keep in mind. Last year we had the derecho that ripped through Iowa and into areas of Illinois and portions of Indiana as well. But we got down and had to untangle the plants in a lot of cases and take a measurement, and then you record the data. But then in the notes you have to, we asked them to give us an indication of, how much of this do you think is harvestable? And that all came into play with the pro farmer estimates, which are aside from the crop tour data, like I mentioned before.
You look at this root zone moisture map, and this is, moisture in that top 3 foot of soil. And you see the difference between that and the drought zone, the drought monitor. And this is actually looking at, one's longer term, how dry are we? And the other is, well, what does it look like right now? Yeah. And to me, it's just so telling the difference between East and West on the crop tour. And Chip, I think that will be the most interesting side of this, is to look at, okay, is it too much rain? Because we've seen that. Can the crop finish out? Or is there enough nitrogen left in the tank for some of these fields? And then, you know, how does the plant health? How has it gotten through? What is the ear set? How many,
Yep.
you know, like what's the stand count, like you mentioned, Chip? It's going to be interesting.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's always interesting. And you used one of my favorite words to describe what the crop tour is, and that's discovery,
Right.
because it is a discovery process. And as long as you allow the tour to be the discovery process that it is, you can learn from it. If you want to fight it every step of the way and say, I can't believe that they're finding good yields in northern Iowa, they haven't had an inch, you know, if you want to fight it, you can fight it. But if you let it be the discovery process that it is, then you can you can use it to your advantage in your marketing, not just short-term marketing on this year's crop, but when we get into a situation like we are in right now with tight supplies, the observations that we collect on tour this year will have an impact on your marketing of the 21 crop. It'll influence your decision making on the 22 crop marketings, and maybe even beyond that.
Yeah, Brian, I mean, we were talking about, you know, we just had a USDA report last week, or was it this week? It was this week, wasn't it?
This week.
Yeah, it's only Thursday. We just had a USDA report where we looked at, you know, kind of some of the production and the carryovers and the stocks reports, the global stocks reports, and there's going to be a lot of attention paid to crop tour this year, I think, because of the global situation that we have going.
Well,
Right.
undoubtedly, and there's very little cushion for U.S. corn and soybeans on the U.S. balance sheets. But then you mentioned the global as well. So you know, we're into this period of tightness where we just don't have a lot of margin for error, and you know, that's part of the discovery process. You know, I think that, you know, one of the things I want to go back to what you said before was plant health and observations. And that's what we rely on those veteran scouts and our farmers for when we go into fields. So, you know, maybe it looks like you take your measurements and maybe the measurements are, you know, decent, but you look at the plant health and you look at the nitrogen loss and the yellowing of plants and that type of thing. And that's where the value comes in when you go on tour and you participate on tour and you get to see it firsthand. And one of the things I always do, you know, when I come out of the field before we do the calculations and all that stuff, is I have a number that's kind of in my head on what it should calculate out to be. And then we calculate it out. And you know, because I've done this for so many years, I'm generally pretty close on that. But then I'll tell our scouts that are with me, I'll be like, well, I think it's going to do better than that because, or I don't think it'll quite get to that level because, and that's some of the value of going and seeing the crop firsthand, you know, and actually getting out and getting your boots dirty and those types of things.
Yep. Clinton, he's talking about expectations, which
Sure.
is what you're talking about here. And you've got, we try to let the tour be the discovery process that it is. But as Brian was saying at the start, we do pay attention to crop conditions leading up to crop tour. So we've got a certain set of expectations when we go out there in the field that we've got to deal with and manage as we're pulling those samples and calculating the yields. And what Brian just described is a great way to manage those expectations. You know, you do it again when you get to the field. You take a look around you. Man, this feels like a 220 bushel cornfield. You get out of it and you calculate 180 and you think, geez, what went wrong there? Well, okay, look at that. It's in the ear size. That's what happened. We don't have the grain inches. You know, it's gaining an understanding of what's out there in the field and the experience and the observations. So critical. And Brian, we've talked a lot about corn, but the observations that we make of the bean crop are more important than pods that we count.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we've had issues in the past with sudden death. We've had issues with white mold. We've had, you know, those disease issues, insect infestations with aphids and those types of things, beetles. You know, that's the type of thing that when you get out there and you take a look, I mean, if you're just driving by at 65, 70 miles an hour, you're probably not going to see some of that. In all likelihood, you won't. When you get out in there, your mind may be a little bit different and the data may be different than what you saw from the road when you pulled up to the field, or what you saw as you were driving by fields and those types of things. The other thing is that we take a corn and soybean stop together as much as we can, which is almost every single stop along those 1,500 cumulative there. And you don't always you might have a really good cornfield and then a soybean field where you're like, wow, where'd all the pods go? It's amazing how many times that has happened, or vice versa. It's a really good soybean pod count, but the corn just wasn't there, and they're side by side, literally side by side. And so, that's the things and the experiences over the years that, it doesn't surprise you as much. And it all comes back to the data. It's data. I mean, that's what the tour is built on. It's the data.
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in. One of the things that we always talk about is, whenever you get to the end of the week, there's the crop tour number from the states that the scouts went to, and then there's the pro farmer number. We've talked a little bit about that. And if you're looking at this map, you can say, look at northern Minnesota, look at North Dakota. We talked a little bit about that already. But look at the rainfall that we've had through states like Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee, traditionally pretty good states as far as crops go. But all of that gets factored in eventually into those final numbers, and then gets compared and thrown back against USDA. And traditionally, that's been a pretty good benchmark.
Yeah, so what we're looking at there, that the chart you have on your screen is that's the pro farmer numbers, the crop tour numbers against USDA's final. And, what we're really looking at there is to get the trend. We don't, the years when we've missed the trend, which are few, something went wrong, obviously, or there was a disastrous finish to the crop generally, or a really good finish to the crop, or something from the third week of August that changed things from what we pulled. But if you look at the history of that all the way back to 2001, we generally get the trend right. And that's the important thing coming out of it. And then we know historically how much we miss each state by. So the data that comes out, if at a bare minimum, you can take the historical factor and apply it to that particular state, and you can get pretty close usually to where it will end up for final yield there. Yeah, and that's what I'm referencing there. So
right,
that 7 state all the way at the bottom of that, you can see that we are back to 2001, 6.2 bushels too high. And when you look at those 7 states, if they don't pull up the average yield for the rest of the country, then probably we've had a train wreck at that point in time. Yep. Those 7 states should be your highest yielding.
Yep. And a couple of other ones that really stand out on that table there. Nebraska, when we wrap up in Nebraska, you got to add almost 15 bushels. Now, why is that? Well, we do most of the touring through the eastern half of the state. We get as far west as Grand Island. One route goes a little bit further west than that, but we are in the area where the dry land production is. The state of Nebraska is about 60% irrigated and 40% dry land. Well, our samples will be about 60% dry land and 40% irrigated. So just the opposite of what the state is. So we've got more dry land samples than it's out of proportion. So you got to add that many bushels. Now in Minnesota, the reason that you're having to take almost 8 bushels off of the yield is because we do everything, not everything, the 90% of the samples are going to come out of the bottom 3 crop districts in the state. So we stay in southern Minnesota, which has the higher production potential than central and some of the northern areas.
Yeah, and that number's narrowed up over the course of time because that central Minnesota into northern Minnesota has really improved their yields, recently, and so that number is smaller now. The adjustment factor or the average miss in Minnesota is smaller than what it used to be.
Yep.
Well, it's always interesting. Of course, I want to remind folks if they've got questions, please feel free to go ahead and jump in. You can ask those questions. And that's the great part about this event, guys, is doing the not only the broadcast that we did last year, we had great questions then, but the in-person events that we're bringing back this year is going to be a lot of fun because we always get such great questions. And I know both of you probably have your favorites and ones that often get asked, but I'm going to ask you now, like, what is one that you're going to get that you're going to have to answer every year without a doubt on Crop Tour?
Well, I addressed it earlier, but do you only pick the good fields? Do you only pick the poor fields? That's a popular one. Isn't going to come up this year, but one of my favorites of all time is how do you account for prevent plant acres?
Yeah.
That one a couple of years ago was like, I mean, I asked it before. I said, okay, I'm just going to save you guys a breath and ask it up front so you don't have to and answer it for you. But those types of things. Are you just driving by at 70 miles an hour? No, we get out into the fields and we actually pull physical samples. Behind USDA, we're number 2 in terms of physical samples pulled. And I don't know who's number 3, but it's not even close to what we do. So those are always ones that we get every single year. Chip, I'm sure you've got a few.
Well, yeah, I like the one. How do you get the bus down the gravel roads?
Yeah. Yes.
There's no bus. We travel in small teams. We run 12 routes through the eastern states. We run 10 routes through the western states. And that's what gives us the ability to cover so much ground in such a short period of time. Cumulative miles traveled, like Brian was talking about, it's going to be close to 30,000 miles when we're done with this thing. It takes 25,000 miles to drive around the world. So we're going to cover 30,000 miles in 7 states, and we don't even get to all of the states. Iowa's the only one where we will pull a sample from every county in the state. So it's really an amazing effort, and the Scouts' commitment to it is what makes it so work as well as it does. The acreage question is always a question. Why don't you go to North Dakota? Well, it's because we've never gone to North Dakota. Why don't you do Missouri? Same reason as we don't do North Dakota. A lot of those kinds of issues, and of course the field selection. How do you select the fields? And it's done. We do it as consistently random as we have done it for the last 28 years out there, and it's that randomness that brings the legitimacy to the tour and the numbers that we are collecting. The other one, and this one will go back to the first time that we reported collected a corn yield sample that went over 300 bushels per acre. A longtime scout, Paul Neefer, Farm CPA, was with the group that pulled that sample here. What was it, Brian? 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, it was probably at least that long.
Yeah. Well, we reported it and we said, hey, look at this 300 bushel sample. And the people basically went crazy with, why in the world would you talk about that? Well, it's kind of a, it's a watershed moment. It's something that we hadn't done before. And that's one of those news items like you were talking about, Clinton. And it's why we beg people to have fun with the tour during the week, but wait for the final numbers. Right. Wait for the final numbers each night on a state-by-state basis. And without a question, the most important number that we look at the entire week is when we pull all the samples together and calculate one average yield for corn from those 7 states. That is the most important number that Brian will deliver to Pro Farmer members in the Pro Farmer newsletter there on Friday.
Yeah, I was going to address that one. One of the other questions is how close does your formula get in each field? You know, it could get lucky and hit it. I'm not really interested in field by field. I mean, you record the data, but the data is one of 1,500 data points at the end of the week, and that's the important one that Chip mentioned. It's the average of all those 1,500 samples. It's not what one spot in that field calculated out at, because that one spot in the field may be the best or the worst in that individual field. So the likelihood that you hit it is limited. The other thing is crop maturity comes into play. The more mature the crop, the closer the formula gets. The less mature the crop, the further off it or the greater margin of error there is within the formula.
Yeah, and that's because of how the crop will finish from that point forward, from the 3rd week of August forward. And that's where it gets down to. Some years we're out there on the road, Brian, saying, well, doggone it, we're measuring yield potential. This and other years we'll say we're measuring actual yield. And with the planting dates and everything from this year and how quickly the crop got to pollination, there not much delay on it. It feels like one of those years when we're going to be out there and measuring actual yield again.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we can rely on USDA's crop condition ratings for.
Yeah,
it tells us the stage of development. And is it 100% accurate? No, probably not, but it really is pretty close when all is said and done. And we do know, like you mentioned, that this year's crop is at least on average maturity and a little bit ahead. And so we should be measuring more yield, actual yield than potential.
yeah.
And like I mentioned before, the formula works better when you're measuring actual yield versus potential.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that, and just I know both of you generally go opposite directions, right? So, Brian, you've been out on the eastern leg of the tour for a lot of years, and Chip, you've been out on the western leg of the tour. I want you guys to divide that up, and Brian. So, from the eastern leg of the tour, the last few years, it seems like every year we come up with a buzzword, either potential or better than expected, or, you name it. But tell us what kind of trends and things on the eastern leg of the tour that you'll be looking for this year to kind of give you a gauge of where we're at.
Well, we've got some pretty good here sitting in mid-July, and it can change in the next month, but we've got some pretty good crop conditions out in the eastern Corn Belt where I'll be. So, you go in with the expectation that, hey, we're going to see at least what will be a pretty good looking crop. Now, how much grain it's got beyond that, that sometimes is a completely different story, but we'll be seeing some pretty decent fields. We also know we talked about the extreme wetness through central Illinois and some of those areas, and you showed that map, but there's probably going to be some fields where we run into with some drown out issues and those types of things. But as a whole, I think the eastern Corn Belt, as we sit here in mid-July, is in pretty decent shape. The western side, they're going to run into more of the drought issues when you get up into that north central, northwestern Iowa area, southern Minnesota, into portions of the eastern half of Nebraska, and then southeastern South Dakota. We take soil moisture ratings for the soybean crop because that matters. And, I think it's probably going to be pretty stark difference between the 4 Western Corn Belt states and the 3 Eastern Corn Belt states. And you kind of split Iowa there because the eastern half of Iowa is probably going to trend more like the other 3 Eastern Belt states, and the western half of Iowa will trend drier.
Yeah.
What do you think, Chip? What things or trends do you think we'll be watching out west versus east?
Big yields are built by consistency in the crop. we, you know, I'm going back a long ways on you now, back to 1994. But that was the first time. And, you know, we started running the tour in 1993, but it was around before that. Jim Quinton had the tour before that. Illinois Farm Bureau had it before that, before Jim. So it's been around for a long time. We've had it for a long time now. But and I had been on several tours before 1994. And that's why that year stands out to me so much, is because the corn crop was so consistent from east to west, west to east, north to south. And it was a record national average corn yield that year. But when we talk about the consistency of the crop, it's not just the final yield. It was the ear set on the crop. It was the stand that we saw, even pre-BT, the stand that we were looking at on the crop. Now, when we go out, when we talk about consistency, we're talking about picket fence stands and ear sets that you could, you know, you could put a laser leveler down the row and hit every ear. If we run into that kind of consistency, boy, you got to look out. You got to look out on what the corn yield could be. If we're in a situation where our ear populations go up and down and are variable from field to field or even row to row, there's times in those years where the corn crop ends up disappointing you, that there's a 6, 8, even 10 ear difference in rows that are right next to each other on those ear counts. So we got to watch that. And then the ear sets. Where is it? Is it hitting that laser leveler, or do we have ear sets from the top of your head down to your waist? So that's an emergence issue that we're looking at. And obviously those plants that are behind are getting beat up all season long by their big brother, and they're just not going to have the yield potential. We're going to count that ear. We're going to count that ear, even if it's the worst ear in the 30 foot of row that we lay out. We will count that ear. But if it ends up as the 5th, the 8th, or the 11th ear that we pull from every row, we're going to pull it, even if it's an outlier to the downside. We're still going to pull it if it's the 5th, the 8th, or the 11th ear in that row, because we always pull the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th ear. We don't ignore any of the ears. We don't ignore any of the observations. And so many times we will see comments like 2 good ears and a so-so ear, or a runt ear. And when we start seeing comments like that in the sidelines, I start pulling back on my expectations. So I'm going to be looking for the consistency in the reporting and the numbers and the ear size and the ear set and everything. And boy, if we see that, then that 179.5 might be right there. Who knows?
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Anything you want to add to that, Brian? I'm going to skip back to the online information. Remember, folks, if you've got questions, jump in here and ask them. We've probably got just a few more minutes left, but please, jump in and ask some questions. Brian, I'll let you go back to.
You mentioned buzzwords every year. If it's variability, then we're probably going to lean down on yield. If it's consistency, then you probably lean up on yield, and that's, when you see it field after field after field, and if every field is different, well, it becomes harder to build a big yield at that point in time.
Yep.
If every field's the same, wow, like Chip said, watch out. Then we've got really big yield potential out there.
Yep. Guys, we haven't talked a whole lot about soybeans, and there's one thing that I think is going to be a newsmaker coming out of the 2021 tour, and that is, I'm just guessing. At this point, I mean, it's July 15th. We've got right at 30 days before we get out there in the field. But I'm just guessing that our pod counts are going to be down significantly from what they were last year. And last year was a year where we saw the pod counts really go through the roof from 2019. The reason that I'm saying this is something that I got from Ken Ferry in our conversation yesterday. And beans across the Midwest were stunted for a period of time by that heat.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that they're bad beans. It just means that they're not going to be, they won't have the growth that bean crop did last year. And I'm not just talking about shoulder high beans. I'm talking about a lot of nodes on those bean plants that we sampled last year. And every time you've got a node, you've got an opportunity for a pod. And our pod counts last year were shockingly high. So shockingly high that I think this year we're going to be looking at something that's a little more traditional for a bean plant. It might have every bit the yield potential that it had last year. It's just that we're not going to see as many pods on those plants. I'm guessing that is going to be one thing that we're going to walk away from on this on the tour this year.
Yeah, and that's where that rainfall in August and September comes into play, because if you don't have the same number of pods, now you need the rainfall to plump up those beans that are there in those pods, and you know, you could, like you said, Chip, still produce a big yield, but it does require those timely rains late in the season, after we've already got our pod set in place. You know, the other thing to keep in mind is late flowering, and that's one of the things we watch and take note of. You know, if there's still flowers there and they get the late season moisture, some of those will turn into pods and they'll actually help production. If you're measuring a crop, soybean crop that doesn't have flowering and it's done flowering, well, now what's there is there, and it has to hold on to every pod that's there, and it has to plump up every bean that's in those pods and those types of things. It can't abort. And that's where that late season, whether you get the moisture or don't get the moisture, you know, a rainy pattern from mid-August on is generally good for soybeans. Conversely, if you have dryness late in the season, then you typically don't, you know, capture the benefit of all those pods that are out there, and you see your yields back down.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to be a great event this year. We're going to be back doing some in-person stuff. You saw those locations and the dates earlier. We're also doing it online again. Chip and I will be in the studio in South Bend doing an online broadcast each and every night, starting at 7 p.m. Central Time. If you'd like to catch up with that and watch it, go over to farmjournalfielddays.com. That's the best way to be able to register for all of this stuff and be able to track what's going on and be able to keep up with the stuff on Crop Tour. One other thing I need to remind everybody is that a recording of this conversation will be sent out to all who register and will also be available on farmjournal.com. Hey guys, before we wrap up, I want some closing thoughts from each of you as we get ready to step up and here in 30 days, head out on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour once again. Brian, you want to go first, and then Chip will finish with you.
Sure. Absolutely great event. Not only the discovery process that we've talked about here during this webinar, but the people you meet, the experiences that you have over the years, you know, those types of things, the friendships that you make, just a tremendous week. You know, it's always one of those where like we get a month out and I'm getting a little bit, you know, just like, oh, you know, here we go again. But then when Crop Tour week hits, you know, it's game on, and it's time to put your game face on and get out there and roll. And it's the most satisfying week that I have throughout the year.
Chip?
It's a great week of investigative reporting. You know, that's the way, that's my journalist's blood coming out of me. The other thing that we're going to find out is this, I think. You know, last year, the economic incentive to protect that crop and give that crop every last thing that it needed to make every last bushel that it could really wasn't there. And look at how it finished, Beej. You know, the stealthy drought to the west, that had something to do with it. The bushels lost to the derecho, that had something to do with it. But you just wonder if the care and feeding and tending to of that crop last year when everybody was just trying to figure out when we're going to get to 280 corn and when we're going to, and how long beans were going to carry a $7 handle, because we had a 3.3 billion bushel corn carryover estimate and a 610 million bushel bean carryover estimate. That's where we were a year ago for this year. That's what was anticipated at the end of this current marketing year. Here we are now, 135 million bushels. The projections for last year or for next year are that we're still going to remain tight. We had the economic incentive when the crop was produced, what was growing. We had the economic incentive for growers to use every bit of snake oil and charm medicine and yield enhancers that we could have possibly given them. We're going to find out if that stuff works this year.
Going to find out a whole bunch of stuff, guys. Hey, thank you so much for being here as always. We really appreciate everybody taking a few minutes, spending some time with us, doing a little preview of Crop Tour this year. It's always one of our favorite parts of the year. Like you said, Chip, the kind of investigative journalist comes out in you, and you just really want to get out there and see with your own eyes and your own hands what's going on and what the potential is. And because it is potential, you know, nothing here is set in stone. The next 3 weeks following Crop Tour always tends to kind of make or break what happens. But it is such a great look at the crop and what the potential is. So, hey, I appreciate it. I appreciate both of you for doing this with me. I appreciate everybody for joining us here for our webinar. And please stop by again next month. I believe we'll be doing another one of these farm country updates. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.